those who welcome to you all from different parts of the world in different time zones. We're going to start our conversation, um, which is a very short one, yet intriguing and in so many ways an important and urgent political conversation we should be having on this continent, particularly here in Africa. And I am coming from Uganda, and I'm pleased to moderate this panel. David Tshimba is my name. I hail from Uganda Martyrs University and Makerere University. I've been asked to moderate the session, perhaps not least for my own interest in museums and heritage, but most importantly, the politics and the poetics of the returns of some important remains, including bodily remains. That's an exercise I was involved in at Uganda Martyrs University. Last year, we held a very grandiose public exhibition that involved the returns of the relics of the Uganda Martyrs. And we created a whole constituency of interested parties in the conversation about the returns. So with those very modest credentials, I think the organizers saw it wise that we should have a much larger, broader, but also deeper conversation from different experts. So I'm very pleased today that we are going to be listening from those who have been in the thick of it and those who have been thinking for the longest time about this question of um, objects, artifacts, remains that were yesteryears taken from Africa by force, by coercion, by the dull compulsion of force, by negotiations, and whose time has come for um, a restitution, a repatriation, or a loaning. So this conversation is framed as the ethics of and in learning of those objects. I'm going to introduce my panelists very briefly, and I'm going to give them, right after the introduction, a share of their time to take us into what the expertise and the challenges they're facing are like as far as the ethics of learning is concerned. We have with us Paul, Paul Stewens. Paul Stewens joined this conversation from a pedigree of expertise. He's Lalive Maryland Fellow in Arts and Cultural Property Law with a specialization in arts and art history, I guess, from the University of Geneva. He's a doctoral candidate with the Faculty of Law at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. And his research focuses on cultural property protection and restitution, with particular emphasis on natural history objects. He holds a master's in international law from Geneva Graduate Institute and has been involved in several high-profile fossil restitution controversies. We couldn't ask for a better panelist than Paul, coming from Geneva. Thank you so much, Paul, for joining us, and very soon we will be looking forward to hearing your insights. The second panelist we have here with us is Larissa Förster. Larissa Förster is the director of Weltkulturen Museum. Forgive my German. Weltkulturen Museum in Frankfurt in Germany. He's been directing that museum since January 2025, and she holds a doctorate in social and cultural anthropology with a focus on Southern Africa. And she's particularly interested in the questions of provenance and the return of museum objects and human remains. We are so deeply thankful to have Larissa join us. And last but by no means least of all the panelists is Professor Derek Peterson. Professor Derek Peterson is Ali Mazrui Collegiate Professor in the Department of History and the Department of Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan. He was formerly the Director of the African Studies at the Center at the African Studies Center at the same university. He also directed the Center for African Studies at the University of Cambridge many decades ago, and he's a fellow of the Selwyn College at Cambridge University. His scholarly work is about the intellectual and cultural history of Eastern Africa. Um, Professor Peterson is a fellow of the British Academy, and in 2017, he was awarded the MacArthur Genius Award Fellowship. We are so very much pleased to have this lineup of very accomplished panelists. And without much ado, let me start with Paul, if you may, in that very order. Paul, can you walk us through the ethics of and in learning, in as far as the controversies you've been involved in are concerned?
Thank you very much for this generous introduction and also for letting me part of this event. I am here to also as a form of replacement for Professor Antoinette Magé-Dominici here at the University of Geneva, who was unfortunately unavailable to join due to health issues. And so I'll do the best to fill her shoes with the humility that my comparative juniority on the panel commands. Now that we speak of restitution and of the ethics of loaning, I think a good first point of departure from the legal point of view that I try to contribute here is the question why the objects are being loaned in the first place. Why you can't just give them back, simply speaking, just restitute them in the strict sense of the word. And here I would maybe, as a general framing, highlight some particularities of the legal system of the United Kingdom. Now, there are several national museums at the United Kingdom. The British Museum is one of the most notable ones, the London Museum of Natural History, the Victoria and Albert. These institutions are governed by specific laws that govern the accession and de-accession of objects from their collections, among other things. And the British Museum Act of 1963 is famous for being cited as an obstacle to the restitution of objects of colonial provenance because said law prohibits the de-accessioning of objects unless under very specific circumstances, which do not include, in most cases, objects of colonial provenance. Similar provisions are to be found in the laws that govern the other national museums of the UK. We can look to the National Heritage Act, to the Museums and Galleries Act. All these have very similar provisions that prohibit the de-accessioning of objects, but that allow for the loaning of objects. So this is a legal means of temporarily removing objects from National Museum collection in the UK and send them to another institution in the UK or abroad for exhibition reasons or even for study in some cases. So this is, from a legal point of view, something that a British museum can far more easily do, to loan their objects as opposed to restituting them unconditionally. I should add that institutions such as the Cambridge Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology is not governed by these laws because they are restricted to national institutions, and so many of the smaller museums that are there in the UK and that might house objects from Uganda are not governed by these laws and are governed by their own statutes, by the statutes of the Cambridge University Museums, by the Charities Act in certain instances. And so here we have a situation where where the loaning and also the full-out restitution of objects might be easier than in the context of the national museums, which hold some of the most charismatic objects that are still in the focus of Ugandan restitution claims. So this is to set the legal scene and why loans tend to be easier from a legal point of view, easier to achieve, easier to negotiate than an unconditional restitution. When it comes to the justice component and the power balance, if you will, between the former colonizers and the formerly colonized, the idea of a loan contract is a highly unbalanced one in itself, because it imposes a large set of obligations on the borrower of an object and very few obligations on the lender. The lender of an object in the context of a loan agreement is mostly responsible for the authenticity of the object. That the object that is being loaned is actually the one that was requested by the borrower. The borrower, on the other hand, faces all forms of liability for potential damages to the object that is on loan. The borrowers are under the obligation to insure the object. The borrower must ensure the immunity of seizure of an object under certain loan contracts, and the exact terms depend on the loan contract in question. But per se, it is a relatively unbalanced affair that is, for understandable reasons, but still puts a lot of heavier burden on the borrower than on the lender. And I think in the dynamic of the relationship between the United Kingdom and British institutions and Uganda and Ugandan institutions, this is very reflective of a perpetuation of a formerly hierarchical colonizer versus colonized relationship. So it is, in a sense, a form of agreement that puts a heavier burden on the people who have been dispossessed through colonial looting or other forms in the first place. And maybe a last thought to share. I think if we speak about or think about the ethics of loaning and the potential that still lies in a loan agreement such as this, my impression is that that its value lies mostly in it being an intermediate stage, a preliminary stage for future cooperation, a step towards full restitution at a later stage in time. And I think Larissa Förster will maybe be able also to speak about more cases where a loan has later on resulted in a full restitution. And I think this is probably the most accurate way of looking at it, because the agreement that concerns the almost 40 objects that have now been loaned from Cambridge to Uganda is one that is short term. That is a 3-year agreement with the possibility of renewal, but also with the possibility of termination, of course. And so what happens after this first 3-year period, it can go either way. And I think we can consider it a period of trust building and of confidence building at the level of interinstitutional cooperation. It is a transitory stage, in my opinion, but the way that this agreement seems to be structured is, or should perhaps not be the actual end of the process and not an end in and of itself.
Fantastic. Thanks so very much for walking us through that interesting backdrop. I have taken my notes, and we are definitely going to unpack some of these very loaded points you are making there. Let me give the floor to Larissa, and perhaps invite her to walk us through historical injustice versus the imperative of ethics, as far as the loaner and the borrower of these important materials are concerned. Yeah, thanks. Yeah,
Good afternoon. Yeah, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Very happy to be here, because I think the topic that you've chosen for tonight is really very vital in this whole restitution debate. I think what I can contribute is I can contribute another case of a loan procedure that was, as Paul Stewens already indicated, commenced as a loan and then fulfilled or became an accomplished restitution. And I think this is very much the interesting trajectory that a loan can have, and that's also when the case when a loan makes sense. I think when it enables, when it facilitates, maybe even when it makes it easier to restitute. And just to illustrate that, I can draw on that case that I've been involved in. That was the restitution of 23 artifacts from the Ethnological Museum of Berlin to the National Museum of Windhoek in Namibia. And it's interesting that we started this project. Actually, the project, I was an academic advisor to the project, and we conceptualized the project in 2018. And this was a time when the global discourse was still different. There was not, and I'm saying in the beginning of 2018. That means Macron had not issued his statement yet. The restitution report had not been written or published yet. So we were working towards a restitution, but we were working through a loan. And why was that the case? Because it was, as Paul Stewens explained, much easier to do a loan and then turn the incrementally, step by step, turn the loan into a restitution. Because what happened is that actually we could do this on the level of cooperation between the institutions. Because the loan or the permanent, it was a kind of permanent loan because it had not very exact and formal restrictions placed on it. So the rationale is to return the objects, for the objects to be there, be accessible in Namibia, and then for the Namibian stakeholders to then make a restitution demand, and for the museum to thereby be able to answer that demand by drafting this restitution agreement and then just kind of leave the objects where they were at that time, which was already in Namibia. So it was a kind of incremental restitution. And at that time, it was a way to get the objects to Namibia in the first place, and then see how one can work towards the restitution. And the advantage it had was that we didn't have to involve the national level. We didn't have to involve the foreign ministry, for example. And we know that, the more official, the more formal restitution demands are, the more stakeholders, negotiate back and forth, try to streamline, mainstream, etc., the process. And this was, for us, we were able to really negotiate that between the two institutions. I mean, the National Museum of Namibia is still a national institution, but on the German side, it was the Ethnological Museum that could decide on the restitution. And that made things pragmatic, I would say. And I think this is wherein the advantage of loan as a stepping stone to restitution can lie, that it's the kind of first step to get the restitution and negotiation process going. Because we've seen in the past years, in particular in cases where, let's say, the national and the subnational levels are not in full accordance, and have different interests, for example, then it's easier for the institutions involved, the heritage practitioners, to negotiate a loan than negotiating a restitution. And I think that's the advantage that a loan offers. But I also fully agree with what Paul said. On a broader and a deeper historical level, the loan, it's a kind of pragmatic administrative tool. If we are not successful to turn that tool into a full restitution, then it's somehow also cynical, to loan objects back, in particular those that might have been looted before. So I think it holds value as the kind of stepping stone and as a trailblazer for this, or as a compromise, let's say a compromise on the way to full restitution.
Okay, thanks so very much for that. Thanks. That was just want to clarify. That was the early 2018. You said as when you started
That's
on
when
this.
we conceptualized the project, and then the
Yeah.
the physical return of the objects took place in 22. But that
2022.
was the loan. That was administratively, that was a loan. And then 2 years later, it was turned, I mean, the loan agreement was replaced by a restitution agreement.
Restitution agreement. Interesting.
While
That
the
was the
objects were already in Namibia, so nothing needed to happen to the objects. It was the paperwork where the loan agreement was turned into a restitution agreement.
It's a very interesting case because I mean Macron's speech in Ouagadougou is in November 2017. So Macron gave a very uh, kind of monumental speech, which is at the heart of the restitution debate just in November, and you come in 2018. So a very interesting
Right.
case.
I'm saying that this is that chronologically speaking, in the strict sense, that was a mistake. That's true. Formally, we started this project. Informally, it already started in 2017 because it was based on the Namibian African Accession Project, which
Okay.
already commenced in 2014. So there was
Yeah, I think you definitely
was
were ahead of the
complicated.
curve.
There was those, this historical perspective. Yeah.
I bet probably you're ahead of the curve. Macron must be putting his tenterhooks into your conversations there. Glad. Um, then let us be walk through the case, the Uganda case, which has been kind of signposted by both Paul and we're going to come back to Larissa's case. But let me give the floor to Derek to walk us through the Uganda case, famous 39 objects that have returned. And what is in it? What's the place of the question of the ethics of learning in this Ugandan case, Derek? Thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dodi. Pleasure to be on this panel. I'm sorry I'm not in Kampala with you. I'm in Michigan, where I'm based now. So I'm a history professor. I'm also the principal investigator, as it's termed, behind the project that gave rise to the return of those 39 objects last year in June. I've been working closely with colleagues at the Uganda Museum, particularly Nelson Abiti, who's the co-principal investigator with me in this whole project, which is funded by the Mellon Foundation, which is an American-based foundation. I wanted to show you some pictures to give you a sense of what the objects that we're talking about look like and to give you some idea of the research we're doing at the moment about their provenance. So here we go with a slideshow, which I hope you can see. If you can't, Dowdy, I presume you can now see them.
It's all great now. Yeah.
Okay, so I've been working with the Uganda Museum in Kampala for some years to expand what the museum can do to narrate Uganda's contested political history. It's worth saying that Uganda's National Museum does not have a national history gallery. This is, as a historian, this is, in my view, a problem, and not just for academic reasons. In the absence of a National History Gallery, it's difficult for Ugandans to see what they share, what cultural property, what shared experience, what future they might share and build together. So the dominant space in the museum, as many of the folks on this call will know, is the Ethnography Gallery, formerly called the Tribal Hall, the earliest part of the museum in terms of its collecting history. All the objects that are on display in the Ethnography Hall were laid out, the exhibitions were laid out, that is, in the late 1950s, early 1960s, when British curators, particularly Marek Poznański and his successors, designed the exhibitions that now inhabit the Ethnography Hall. It's not badly displayed, but it is, as you'll see, an exhibition that presumes that all of material culture can be divided into ethnic boxes. So that's not just a sandal, that's a Ganda sandal. That's not just an apron, that's an Acholi apron. Everything in the exhibition is labeled as though it belonged to some ethnic group or another. So for the past several years, for the past now nearly 20 years, I've been working with a range of institutions across the country to expand what we can know as citizens and as scholars about Uganda's past, particularly focusing on paper archives. Over the past 15 years, I've been working particularly closely with Mountains of the Moon University in Fort Portal to digitize government records, resulting in a very large digitized collection of material that Dowdy, our distinguished chair himself, has contributed to over the course of time. I've also been working with the Uganda Broadcasting Corporation in Kampala to digitize and make available endangered analog media assets like the photographs. These are photographic negatives that we digitized from the UBC headquarters on Nile Avenue in the late 2010s and during the pandemic in the 2020s as well. This work in turn has given rise to a series of museum exhibitions in Kampala at the Uganda Museum, where the archival material that we've digitized can be now used for the purposes of creating historical exhibitions. So here's an exhibition we put on in 2019 featuring photographs from the UBC headquarters, largely derived from the 1970s, that is, the photo archive of Ugandan dictator Idi Amin. The Unseen Archive of Idi Amin exhibition was on show in the months right before the pandemic, after which we had to close it down, unfortunately. And then in 2022, we laid out an exhibition at the museum celebrating the 60th anniversary of Ugandan independence. It was opened by His Excellency the President, the first time that a sitting president of Uganda had entered the halls of the Uganda Museum. He was there very briefly, but he did in fact go into the museum, which was a kind of landmark occasion. So most recently, I've been working with the MAA in Cambridge to get hold of artifacts that can help us tell new stories about Uganda's shared and overlapping history. The MAA in Cambridge is a university museum. It's not a government museum. And as one of my co-panelists pointed out, this is important because we haven't had to deal directly with the UK government. The repatriation of the 39 artifacts about which we're all concerned was conceived as part of a project that I put to the Mellon Foundation in dialogue with colleagues from Uganda and from Cambridge, where I used to work, as Dowdy mentioned. The MAA in Cambridge has thousands of artifacts from Uganda. Most of them are bits of stone. That is, they're archaeological artifacts that have been dug up over the course of time. They're interesting, but there's just, hundreds and hundreds of them, bits of rock that are hard to do very much with. There is a smaller collection of ethnographic objects that were put together in the late 19th, early 20th century by British collectors, and that's what our project has largely been focused on. We were able to get Cambridge on board with the idea of sending back to Uganda a selection of their larger ethnographic collection, which is housed in the boxes that you can see here. This is in the newly renovated museum stores in Cambridge, which we very generously had access to thanks to the MAA's willingness to work with us on this. In November 2022, curators from the museum in Kampala and myself came to Cambridge, where we examined a whole pile of interesting ethnographic objects and made choices about what we could afford within the limits of the budget to send to Kampala. Over the ensuing months, we worked with the MAA curators and with colleagues in Kampala to put together a plan. The repatriation of the objects, the negotiating around it, took several months of work, in part because we had to clear, among other things, the legislation around the repatriation of artifacts. Even if not a government museum, the MAA is obliged to work within the strictures of what's called the Charities Act, which has been revised very recently in the past few years, but which does oblige UK charities to place before the British government and the Charities Commission their plan for deaccessioning objects that they wish to send on to other institutions, that is, to which they wish to make permanent gifts of objects in their collections. That process of clearing through the Charities Commission would have obliged us as organizers of this project to go through a multi-year and financially very expensive process by which we would have had to reimburse the University of Cambridge for the financial, as we understood it, the financial cost of the objects that Uganda would have claimed. And those costs would have been very considerable, well outside the financial resources that we had to bear. That is, the artifacts we're talking about are over 100 years old. Some of them are collector's items on the international art market, against which they would be valued, by the way, with the result that after looking at the finances and talking about the logistics, we settled on a 3-year loan, renewable, without the expectation of return, but with the need every 3 years to renew the loan, at least until it's extended. This was conceived at the start as the first step in what would become a permanent restitution from my colleagues in Cambridge to the Uganda Museum. And it now sort of stands in the hands of the Uganda Museum to organize a more permanent claim that will result in the transfer of the ownership of these objects to Uganda. Organizing the repatriation of these things took quite a lot of work. On the screen there is what do you call it? The Excel spreadsheet by which we worked out what exactly each of these 39 objects was made of. We had to clear through a British process involving endangered species, requiring that is to make sure that all the objects that we were sending back were made of materials that were not from endangered species. And if they were from endangered species, that is endangered in the 21st century, we had to explain why these things were important and had to be shipped back to Uganda. All of this took a lot of investigatory work that stretched out over several months of speculation. Here's the website for the Charities Commission, which oversees this whole process. The result of all this was that in June 2024, we were able to get 39 objects onto an airplane in several large crates where they landed in Entebbe and were greeted by the State Minister for Culture and Tourism, who's here on the screen, at a press conference at Entebbe Airport. Over the course of the ensuing weeks, the objects that had come from Cambridge were unboxed and subject to scrutiny. The UK curators examined each object as it came out of the packing material. So did the Uganda curators. And we signed agreements. They signed, I wasn't involved in this. They signed agreements between the two institutions, certifying the condition of all of these objects as they were returned to Kampala. I want now to talk about the provenance briefly of some of the pieces we've brought back as a way of sort of signaling what I think to be the plan that lies ahead. One thing to flag up about all the 39 pieces we've brought back is that they were acquired by British collectors in a range of different kinds of circumstances. There is no one provenance history that lies behind these pieces. Not all of them were stolen. In fact, most of them were purchased by British collectors. In other instances, the objects were given willingly, it seems, by African possessors to British collectors out of a sense of purpose, which I hope to speak to briefly here, given the limits of time. As a historian, the argument I want to make about these artifacts is that they are, among other things, relics that reflect on the shared violence that ushered in colonial rule at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. They were generally not stolen away by malevolent colonial conquistadors. That is, they were not, they're not the sort of relics of thievery per se. What they are, I think, is more interesting, actually. And that is that their reflections, their possession by British collectors reflects the dramatic epistemological political changes that accompanied Uganda's introduction into the British Empire. They're evidence, that is, of the cultural violence that attended the onset of colonial rule, and therefore they're evidence of what it is that Ugandans shared in their experience of being colonized in those years. So several of the objects that we brought back are mayembe. That is, I'm not entirely sure how to translate the term, but the British collectors called them fetishes or charms. Here's a few of them on the screen. These objects, these mayembe, were brought to Cambridge in 1903 by the Katikero of the Kingdom of Uganda, Apollo Kagwa, who was, in the early 20th century, consolidating his power as the newly ascendant Protestant prime minister of Uganda's leading kingdom. So here's Kagwa, 1902, at the doors of King's College, Cambridge. He had come to England along with Ham Mukasa, who was his secretary at the time, for purposes of attending the coronation of King Edward II. And he brought with him a whole pile of mayembe, which he handed on to the MAA in Cambridge as a kind of courtesy. In those years, Kagwa was building a newly founded Protestant kingdom. He was the leading regent among three regents who had been empowered after 1900 to govern Buganda on behalf of the then child king, Daudi Chwa, who was then 3 years of age. Here's Daudi Chwa's writing book, which I dug up a few months ago from the archives of the Church Missionary Society. Daudi Chwa, at the time that Kagwa came to England, was just out of his infancy. And Kagwa came to the UK as the most powerful person, really, in the protectorate of Uganda, the architect, really, of a new political society that was founded on Protestant Christianity and that was based on the premise that the Kabaka, and particularly his prime minister, were to stand at the center of all politics. So in those years, Kagwa and his colleagues were busily seeking to suppress alternate forms of power and other centers of authority within the Buganda kingdom. Here's a letter of complaint from the Nalinya, that is the king's sister, describing how in those years Kagwa had gone about unearthing the graves of the ancestors that had been buried on their land and depriving them of property that they had possessed in earlier times. Kagwa was particularly focused on uprooting the power of the Balubale and their priests, that is, the ancestral spirits whose power, in some sense, relativized the authority of the aristocrats who sat in Mengo. That is, his campaign against the shrine priests was not simply a religious campaign, it was also about consolidating power in his own hands. And so Kagwa set about destroying the shrines of priests and undermining other centers of power in order to build up authority in his own hands. So when he brings these fetishes, as they were called, to Cambridge in 1902, 1903, one can see them as stolen objects that had been taken away, perhaps from shrine priest possession, but one can also see them, perhaps more consequentially, as evidence of the campaign that Kagwa and other builders of a Protestant Buganda were conducting against other forms of power by getting these mayembe out of the Kingdom of Buganda. Kagwa was in some sense depriving older religious authorities of their power, of the instruments by which they'd exercised and convinced others of their authority, and in some way also consolidating authority around a novel idea about religious power, that is the monotheistic system that undergirds Christianity. A similar set of dynamics guided his colleague and co-collector John Roscoe, the missionary collector who worked alongside Apollo Kagwa to acquire important objects in those years and to send them off to Cambridge. So here's Kagwa's letter from 1908 describing how he had acquired a collection of fetishes and medicine from the possession of a shrine priest who had brought them to him and who willingly described their function and purpose for his edification. John Roscoe was an aspiring academic and a missionary who wanted very much to be a lecturer at Cambridge University, but who, in the absence of an academic appointment, had come off to Uganda to practice missionary work. He spent his whole career collecting ethnographic objects and writing important historical and ethnographic work. And among other things, he worked closely with Apollo Kagwa to get hold of objects that were being outmoded at the very time of their collection. So one such object that he gets from this unnamed shrine priest is an object that we brought back to Kampala earlier in 2024, a nine-mouthed drinking pot shown here on the screen, which Akagwa acquired from this shrine priest, as I mentioned, in 1908, one of several objects that the shrine priest handed on to Roscoe in exchange probably for some money. The shrine priest's power had been undermined, it seems, by religious change, by the changing epistemological systems of the day. There's financial incentives at stake. Roscoe had money to offer. And so this priest willingly, apparently, sells off some of the artifacts of his authority for the purpose of perhaps repositioning himself within public life and also of making some funds, rupees, that is, off of his possessions. A third set of collections I want to talk briefly about were brought to Cambridge in 1913 by John Roscoe, acquired in the early 20th century in Ankole in southern Uganda. These are a set of beautiful pots that are beautifully inscribed, as you can see from the screen. They're decorated in a manner that it seems is rather different from the style that today guides the convention of Kinyankole art. So here's a photograph that Roscoe made in the early 20th century when he visited Ruharo. These are a series of milk pots that were brought out for his inspection. Roscoe seems to have acquired the pots we've recently brought back to Kampala through purchase. We can divine that in part because the bottom of all of these pots has got on the bottom a number. It's either a 7,000 or a 1,000, suggesting that these beautiful pots, made in a style that seems to have been innovative and out of keeping with traditional style, that is, these pots seem to have been made for purposes of sale by someone who was experimenting with artistic convention and who was trying to make something beautiful that people would buy. The 1,000 figure or the 7,000 figure, I think probably refers to cowrie shells, which was then the preferred currency in southern Uganda and which was used in commercial exchange in the early 20th century. I haven't yet exactly worked out what 7,000 cowries would be valued at in today's currency, but I'm working through the Uganda archives at the moment to try to figure out what exchange rates were in the early 20th century for cowrie shells as against the rupee, which was the more widely used currency in East Africa in those days. A fourth set of objects I want to talk briefly about comes from northern Uganda. Here, it's not John Roscoe who's the collector. It's a former district commissioner named Frank Rogers, who gave this beautiful object to Cambridge in 1927, having collected it from the chief of Atiak, from the remote of Antioch in Acholi in the early 20th century. The chief's name was Olia, and as this bit of correspondence from the archives shows, Rogers acquired these objects as a gift from Olia, who had been empowered by British administration to govern Atiak, and who was probably the leading Acholi collaborator with British colonial government in those years. The object we're talking about here, this beautiful headpiece, was described by a British missionary in 1907 in the way that you can see on the screen in a book he published titled From Uganda to Khartoum. The missionary, Reverend Lloyd, talks about this curious headpiece made of matted hair with beads neatly stitched into a pattern around it and an empty cartridge case stuck on the top. Old gun caps, writes Reverend Lloyd, are fastened onto the base of the cone and are polished bright, giving it a gaudy experience. and feathers are acquired upon it or placed upon it too, as is a spike of ivory fastened into the hair. This is what the piece looks like. We brought this back to Kampala in June last year. Its name, based on some research that we've done in Gulu, is a otang. Interestingly, I went to Gulu earlier this year to speak with Olia's successor as chief of Atiak, Robot Apire, who's now one of the several chiefs in Acholi country. Regrettably, Robot Apire does not recognize this object. It has no particular currency in Acholi cultural life today. Those of you who come from, who are attending this call from Uganda will know that northern Uganda has been the scene over the course of decades of awful, unsettling violence organized by the Lord's Resistance Army. And it seems that Acholi chiefs and Acholi culture brokers have lost the sort of shared memory of artifacts that had once been central, it seems, to their political culture. So today, Chief Olia's successor has no memory of what this piece might be. But back in the day, Olia seems to have used these kinds of diplomatic gifts for the purpose, we have to presume, of greasing his relationship with British administrators. Here's a letter from 1905 describing the services that Chief Olia was doing to British administration in Nimule district in what was then called Nile province. And you can see on the screen here a report around Olia's success in collecting taxes and administering Atiak on behalf of British authorities. As I mentioned, he was one of the earliest of Acholi chiefs to cooperate with British administration. I've got other artifacts I could talk about if you want me to, and I'm happy to do so in future if you'd like. But for the moment, I'll stop and simply flag up what I think to be the key point. All of these objects reflect the cultural and political displacements of colonial government. They're evidence of what Ugandans shared, the shared trauma and shared experience of colonial rule, and they belong in Uganda's National Museum for that reason, as evidence of a kind of shared Ugandan national experience. Thanks very much.
Thanks so very much indeed. There's so much to work with here, so much, a mouthful. Now, let me just open it up as an intra discussion among the panelists, and then we shall invite the audience here. So there are a couple of things that seem to connect all the panelists. I hope we had a conference before coming here. It sounds like we had a conference of the panelists agreeing on the key points. But maybe from Paul to Derek, and then back from Larissa to Derek. The issue of the objects, objects taken. So I get it that might have been, some are purchased, some must have been gifted, some were unclaimed, some stolen. But there is another category of things which I want to introduce the discussion here. Objects borrowed to the will-be lender now. So how do we discuss the ethics of loaning for the objects that have a whole variety of sources of provenance? How does provenance, when thrown into the thick of the conversation about loans and restitution, how does the nature of the provenance complicates our conversation? Let me talk about objects unclaimed, or those we may say that they were actually borrowed. Maybe we are toward the very tail end. We are at the beginning of colonial rule, and a saucer was given so that someone can understand how people are cooking, and then this British colonial ruler or German administrator was changed, and then he packed the thing, and then he gave it to someone else, and then someone else never returned it. It was borrowed, and then today we're talking about loaning. So can we still talk about loaning for objects which were actually also loaned in the first place? I would like the panelists to speak to the nature of objects before we can entertain whether loaning is an important stepping stone, which is the point that we all seem to share, that loaning is a very important strategic and perhaps legally and bureaucratically step toward restitution. Let me start. Yeah, maybe Larissa can tell us from his case, connecting to Derek's case, provenance versus the demands of loan versus restitution.
I think what Derek's presentation makes so clear is that we have to really look at each single object. I think that's also the intellectual challenge that is posed here, and that's also, I think, the intellectual challenge in terms of what we can learn for history. If we look at the particular objects and we differentiate and we see and we acknowledge some were looted, others were bought, others were even donated or might have been borrowed, whatever, then we understand what one of the historians of colonialism in Germany termed, that he said colonialism is such a manifold, unambiguous ambiguous thing, actually, where you've got so many layers, you've got local agency, you've got power asymmetry, you've got violence, but you've got also local agency that lies, for example, that drives and motivates the donation between elites here and there, for example. And I think that example that what Derek presented makes it quite clear. And I think this is also, I can very much relate to that because that was also the motivation for our project. When we had this cooperation with the Namibian partners, it turned out that they were not so much interested in detecting the violence and detecting the loot, but they were interested in the historical and the artistic significance of objects. And as Derek said, even though some of those objects have been donated, have been given voluntarily, even, maybe under the pressure of colonization, he said they belong in the Uganda Museum because it's as evidence of a national experience. And that's the historical significance. And that's also, I think, why we went in the direction of loan, because, I mean, it's still, if you look at the legislation, for example, or the soft law that we have in Germany, then the soft law, because there is no hard law at the moment for restitution, the soft law, the tendency is that, the more violence is involved, the easier it is legally and administratively to de-accession objects. I mean, because then the political pressure is higher. And that was also one of the reasons why the loan was so appropriate in our case, because most of the objects, we had no clear provenance, and we had, for example, also the provenance of a gift. And that gift was also returned. And back then, it would have been much more difficult to return a gift, to restitute a gift, to transfer ownership of gift. So, but this is so far for the kind of historical perspective on the last 5 or 10 years, where we must acknowledge that the global discourse changed a lot, so that restitution is can much more easily and pragmatically be done today. Yeah, I think it's still this case by case decision, and the case by case intellectual engagement with the history of these objects, and also the discussion of where these objects can unfold a social life again, and where these objects can really convey this important history. And I think like in the example that Gehrig gave, I think the place to convey that history in many cases will be the countries where these objects were produced.
Interesting. Thanks so very much, Larissa. Yes, Paul, take it from there. Derek tells us about the financial implications that are involved even to to the lender on the part of the borrower for objects that must have been in the first place looted or perhaps not just gifted. What's your take there on the as far as the question of justice and historical injustice? For this financial application, that seems to be making a lot of sense, but in the historical perspective, seems to command much less sense, or even remind a very rude example of injustice, writ large.
Certainly. And I think the sheer the logistics and the financing are aspects that, in my impression, are maybe not talked about enough in the restitution context, even in context where this is more has been more prevalent of debate. But just really the nitty-gritty on how we get the objects from A to B and who's going to pay for it, I think is a question that doesn't get enough attention, and I think it is very, very commendable that such a large grant has been obtained from the Mellon Foundation that makes this possible, and that sort of gives a bit of space to experiment with all the attached issues in this case. And I think we were fortunate that Derek Peterson is so generous in sharing the insights from this process. And really the intestines of the restitution process, if you will, because in the end, these are precious objects, and I think this is the thing that usually both sides, even in a less cordial setting of restitution controversy, can agree on. That usually both the Western institution and the country and the communities of origin agree that these are very precious objects, and so I think it's in everybody's interest that they be handled with care and diligence. And here I think the key word is once again burden sharing. And this is, from a justice perspective, not a burden that should be put on the communities of origin at all. Possibly not, also not the institutions in the country of origin, and this is, I find it difficult to provide a solution in abstract that would fit every case. But I think when deciding on who shares on the burden sharing, as far as the financing and the logistics of the restitution goes, two factors need to be taken into consideration. That is, first of all, the context of historical injustice in which these objects were removed. But the second factor to be taken into consideration is also geopolitical situation nowadays, which is in many facets a product of the past injustices and of centuries of foreign domination. And so even just the fact that Western institutions that hold these objects are endowed with disproportionately better means and better resources must also factor into account, or must factor into the decision who bears what share of the burden of the actual logistics of repatriation. And one more aspect in which I wanted to stress, me being in full accord with my co-panelists, is the idea of a case-by-case analysis of the object biographies of the artifacts in question, that then go on to form jointly an archive of the lived shared experience of colonialism, because it contributes to, it adds layers and layers and layers of meaning to an object, that make it even more precious and even more valuable, and I think should then also be made visible when the object is exhibited nowadays. Because if we, I think oftentimes we think of, in the restitution context, of objects as frozen in time, frozen in the moment where they are being removed. Because this is sort of the moment in which the colonial collector or the colonial troops took an interest in them, they removed them, and they are being frozen in time, placed in isolation in a Western institution. But if we look at the example of the new Protestant Prime Minister of Uganda removing these objects from communities that were exercising alternative forms of power, this is already one additional layer of meaning that's being added to the value and the function that this object had for said community. And that is just this is sort of the domestic context of Uganda, of the removal within the country. And then we add another layer of meaning of these objects being gifted to a British museum. And now, with the time that has passed, and also with the restitution, this to me is another layer of meaning in itself. And another thing that becomes part of the object, that becomes part of its significance. And I think part of ascribing a certain form of agency to these objects, and writing an object biography of them, and exhibiting them that way also means representing these layers, and really representing them as what they are, and not only what they used to be when they were removed in 1903.
Okay, thanks. So, Derek, just before I open up the panel to the audience, which is very much eagerly looking forward to Q&A, let me just return to a very critical issue you point to. I mean, in view of Andreas Müller, very prominent German scholar who intervenes in the restitution debates, makes a very basic and yet perhaps insightful point that those involved in actors involved in loans, let alone restitutions, do come in with no equal power. And so, how do we speak to the issue of restitution, or perhaps loaning as a very first important stepping stone toward full restitution for objects which perhaps it's very clearly given the history of provenance that do not even necessitate that strategic stepping stone in the first place? Why do you have to put a stepping stone for something for which history has no favor for any stone? Can you speak something to that? Why didn't you go to MAA and say, for objects A, B, C, D, please, restitution? Objects C, D, E, F, loans. And so we start the conversation from an already engaged geared.
Okay, so those of you who have been following this project will know that there's a lot of different kinds of objects among the 39 that we've returned. There are a number of objects among those collection that are abalongo, which are human remains brought from tombs in Uganda in the early 20th century by John Roscoe and sent off to Cambridge. We're going to make a claim. So those have been brought back to Kampala. They're in the possession of the Uganda Museum. We're in discussions with the appropriate folks in the Kingdom of Uganda about what the future holds for these objects, and it's a matter of discussion now about where they will rest and on what terms. We found folks in the kingdom to be and in the appropriate tomb keepers to be very helpful and engaged and interested in the whole endeavor. The Cambridge folks are keen to hand those off to Ugandan authorities without further demur because they fall within a different set of considerations than do the material objects that I talked about a few minutes ago. It might be that Paul will be able to speak more about this if we wish, but there's a kind of expedited process for repatriating human remains from UK institutions that works to the advantage of the Uganda Museum, in that getting title to those abalongo will be relatively less complicated. So the plan going forward is that the ministry in Kampala is to make it a claim for those objects first, and then in the coming months and years to prepare a claim for the rest of the material objects. Look, Dowdy, one can rail as much as you want against the injustice of British law around these things, and I'm happy to rail with you against it. We would join, the Greeks, we would join the Romans, we would join any number of people who are angry about the fact that the British have stolen all this stuff and tucked it away in their national museums, and then put up a law to make it impossible to get it back. Let's talk about the Parthenon marbles. Let's talk about all the stolen, looted stuff from Egypt that came to the British Museum. So, I accept the point that there is an injustice here, and that, there's all kinds of reasons to look upon this as obnoxious, but it's the system we have to work with. All political activism has to happen within the constraints of what's possible in our current time and place, while making another future, another set of possibilities visible by our actions. So, that's the world that we're working with. The University Museum at Cambridge isn't bound by the same rules that guide the British Museum, as Paul was saying a few minutes ago. They're more free to act. We're more able to launch a claim for the transfer of title, both for the material objects and for the human remains. And if we can get the authorities in Kampala on board, the hope is that within the next, we're planning to have an exhibition about these, featuring these objects in the middle of 2026, assuming all goes to plan, which I hope that it will. And assuming that goes forward, my hope is that colleagues in the ministry in Kampala and authorities at the museum will work together to make a claim for the transfer of title of all these different categories of things.
Wonderful. Thanks so very much. So, Derek is very Marxian there. Men and women don't make the history as they so wish, but they make it within the constraint of what has been given unto them. So let me open this up for our very patient and extremely attentive audience. A couple of questions have already come, a couple of appreciation for our panelists, but it's now your time. So by show of hand, just put your virtual hand up, and you will only be asked to ask one question or one comment. Normal lecture, the panelists have said it. You can just pick a points with them. So direct your question or make your comment to a specific panelist and only just limit it to one so that we can pick as many as we can in the limited time we have. Can I see, we can go by rounds. Can I see by show of hands, by show of the virtual hands, those who want to constitute the first round? And we're going to have just 2 rounds in view of the limited time we have. Yes, Joshua, you're going to go first. Who's next? Can I pick 2, 3 hands? Okay. So let's start with Joshua. Joshua, unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I thank Professor Derek Peterson. I first saw Professor Derek Peterson at the exhibition, the Amin exhibition at the Uganda Museum, and I was very fascinated. And again, I've seen him the second time, and again, he's just put on this very, very excellent talk about the Maembe. And as he was presenting, I kept on thinking, in Uganda, we inherited a colonial education system with the subject of history, where we were taught about the history of Uganda and the colonial, the pre and post-colonial history. And some of the things that Professor Derek has been talking about were never taught to us. So I'm wondering, what was this trick? What was this thing of concealing part of this contest between the Maembe owners and the Kakungulu taking the Maembe to the British Museum? Was it intentional for this education system to conceal some of this very important knowledge, especially about the contest, and then teach us this other history on top of the history? Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Joshua. Is there any other hand? I want to pick 2 more before we move on. Any other comment or question? Okay, Derek, you can have a go at that as other people constitute themselves. Go ahead.
Thanks for your question, Mr. Ibanda. One thing to say is that Apollo Kagwa himself was an avid historian. So one reason why one answer to your question, of course, is that Kagwa authored the definitive history of Buganda, Base Kabaka ba Buganda, and a whole number of other studies of Buganda's politics and history. He worked closely with John Roscoe in authoring his book about the Baganda. Kagwa and Roscoe were collaborators, both in museum collecting, in ethnological research, and in historical work. So what we know about Buganda's distant past rests largely, although not entirely, on Kagwa's intermediation. So, when you ask, why don't we know about Kagwa's self-interested efforts to reform Buganda's politics in the early 20th century in the image of Protestant Christianity. It was not in his self-interest to valorize or celebrate other centers of authority in his historical writing, because as a builder of contemporary Buganda, he was using historical research to validate a centralized, top-down vision of what Buganda was, to the disadvantage of other holders of power, like the Nalinya, who I talked about a minute ago, like the Namasole, who in a former system had been co-equal to the Kabaka in the governance of public affairs in Buganda, but by the 20th century had been thoroughly sidelined by people like Kagwa, Stanislas Mugwanya, and others who were building up this Christian kingdom. And at the expense also of people like Joshua Kate, the Mugema of Busiro, who had formerly been, in the older system, the arbiter of the afterlife, keeper of the Kabaka's tombs, a vital player in Buganda's public life, but who in the 20th century was effectively shorn of his authority at the expense of the people in Mengo who wished to build up a top-down aristocracy at the expense of other holders of power. Buganda had not always been centered around Mengo. That's the point that I'm making. Buganda had been a multi-sided political community prior to the 1900 agreement. It's Kagwa and his historical writing and his political work and the museum collecting that he was doing that reorganized Buganda's politics. And as I've said, that is the vital kind of context for understanding how many of these Chiganda objects ended up in the hands of the Cambridge curators, because Kagwa wanted to get them out of the kingdom. Why he didn't burn the Mayembe, as a later generation of Protestant reformers would do, is an interesting question. If you know something about the mid-20th century history of East African Christianity, you will know that by the 40s, Balokole were avidly burning Mayembe and other artifacts of the old religion to constitute their new religious identities. Kagwa did not burn the Mayembe, perhaps because he thought it to be too radical an act, perhaps because he feared them, perhaps because he wanted to museumize, but not to eradicate the old religion. Museumization, as all of us who work on these things will know, is a way of making things effectively unconsequential, of putting them out off stage. Once they're in that glass box, they can no longer act in public life. And Kagwa recognized the power of museum collecting as a means of rendering older competing ways of organizing public life into anachronisms. So that's what he was doing, I think. It's a very interesting strategy of political consolidation.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Wow.
thank you.
I'm seeing a lineup of museologists and museum officers here. I'm gonna use my moderating dictatorial power to invite them. So Mark, you'll unmute yourself, and then you will say your appreciation, and then I'll give the floor to Emon. I see Emon is on the line here. Emon, definitely you have something to say. I see Salome on the line. Salome, you'll come, and then Michael, who definitely has something to say to this panel, and then finally I'll give the floor to my very dear friend, Denzel Manipol, who is very keenly interested in this conversation. So in that order, Mark, and then we shall go to Emon, and then the rest. Yes, Mike, unmute yourself.
Okay. Thank you, David. Thank you for moderating this session, and I'm particularly interested in Professor Peterson's discussion of the artifacts. How I wish you could even go on and on with this presentation, but I understand we are limited by time. So I'm wondering if it's possible for you to share the recording from this session, because I'm a master's student of fine art, and I think some of the artifacts they presented about could help fill some gaps in my history of art, the research I'm trying to do. So if it's possible, please, I would be grateful. Thank you.
Good, Mike. You are very strategic, Mark. You are turning Derek into your co-supervisor now for your research. Fantastic. We will follow through that. Emon, go ahead. You can unmute yourself. Eamon, then Solomon, then Michael.
You should say that Eamon is a curator at the National Museum.
Exactly.
Yes, David, thank you. Thank you for the moderation, and thank you to the panelists. I think I enjoyed the discussion, and also it was learning. I was learning a lot from it, and I'm very grateful. And obviously, there's this gentleman who was saying, Mark, you wanted to look at this. There's an exhibition happening that's talking about some of these objects at Normal Gallery by Africa Alliance Française Africa and the Goethe Institute. So he can move to Normal Gallery and check them out. And they have a free catalog that's that you can also pick. So he can also take advantage of that. But I didn't have any much comment, but I enjoyed the discussion, and I'm learning more about these objects from what Derek was sharing. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Eamon. Yeah, Solomon, go ahead, Solomon, unmute yourself.
Thank you, David. David, you've really captured me because I'm good at listening. I would like to take this opportunity to just thank the panelists. For me, I'm good at listening and learning. I've liked Peterson's presentation. Peterson, I think Peterson can't recall me, but I'm the lady who
I can, of course, recall you, Solomon.
Yes, I'm the lady who received those artifacts. But I wanted to keep learning to know those artifacts on my fingertips. That is why even I attended this presentation. Thank you very much, Derek. I'm listening and I want to know each and every artifact on my fingertip. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that commitment, Solomon. Mike, do you have something else to chip in? Mike, Tatya Bala.
Yes, my brother.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I joined a little late, but I'm excited. I'm really thrilled by the presentation by Dr. Derek. Now, we are looking at having an exhibition of these restituted objects at the museum that is mid this year. But you know, these are very important. This is a very important history. There is a section of Ugandans outside Kampala. Sometimes many of them may actually have read about them. Can there be an opportunity? We have maybe a traveling exhibition of these objects, particularly like to upcountry museums. We have one in Soroti. We have one in Kabale, and maybe soon one in Arua. So how do these people at a distance benefit from this rich history? And I believe they are Ugandans. We co-own these objects. I submit.
Thank you so very much. You are going to give the floor to the panelists at the end. I see Dr. Chazike, Elizabeth. You have been keenly following this. You can unmute yourself and make your comment or question. Yes, Elizabeth. Yes, you can unmute yourself, Elizabeth.
Sorry.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Actually, I came in the middle. I missed the presentation, so I may not really ask any question other than saying thank you so much, Peterson. I'm following keenly about this debate of loaning, and I'm really wondering how someone can loan what belongs to you and give it to you as a loan.
Fantastic. That's a worthwhile wonder. The panelists should pronounce themselves on that important wonder. Thank you so very much, Liz. Denzel, go ahead. Then we shall come to my panelists as we wrap up. Denzel Manipo, you can unmute yourself. Denzel, are you there? All right, Denzel is not there. So yes, Larissa, then we shall start with you, Larissa. You can also make your comments and also your parting shot.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you also for everyone for the interest in our discussion. I wanted, David, if I might, I wanted to come back to your last question, because I think that still needs an answer. And if I understood correctly, your question was, why do we need a stepping stone for restitution in the first place, instead of doing restitution right away? And I think that's a vital question. And the answer is that it's politically and socially complicated, and it's intellectually complicated, because we see that, let me take Namibia as an example again. We had those 23 objects. Each are 23 objects out of between 15 and 20,000 artifacts or cultural belongings that we have in German-speaking museums in Germany, Switzerland, and Austria that were produced in Namibia. So, and no one really has a good overview. Last year, I released with a colleague of mine, Gesa Grimme and Christoph Rippe, we released that overview of those between 15 and 20,000 Namibian artifacts held in German-speaking European institutions. But for us, it's just too many objects, to really know what to prioritize, even for provenance research. And the same is valid on the Namibian side. So these restitution projects, these first trailblazers, I think they're also entry points. They're catalysts for all of us, in particular also my Namibian colleagues, to start somewhere. And from that, familiarizing themselves with restituted objects and their stories, developing plans and strategies for restitution. And that means broader plans of what to prioritize, what to focus on, what to demand back, because the information is not there yet. We are all learning what we have, and as tragic as this is, that we as institutions also have to say, we're still learning. We've been sitting on those objects or with these objects, and they've been sitting on our shelves for so much time, but we are still busy learning what exactly it is, where it belongs to, what the story behind it is. And it's the same on the other side. I've seen in Namibia, there's a lot of deliberation processes necessary in order for different stakeholders, to come together and make a strategy. And as European institutions, we also have to allow to make space, for those deliberation processes. And those initial restitutions of a small number, maybe on loaning terms in the beginning, they're also catalysts for those broader processes that need their time in order for everyone to come up with a long-term restitution strategy, because it is such masses of objects, that none of us will be happy with all of them just returning at once, without prior consideration, how to have a proper workflow, how to bring on stakeholders, etc. I think we are also challenged, we are all challenged by that. And that's also, these projects are also important for that, to allow for space for deliberation and discussion.
Thanks so very much for that clarification. Then I will invite Paul to give us his parting shot. Perhaps also as he speaks to the question of Denzel here. Paul, Denzel is asking, how do you investigate items that were gifted by African leaders? I will direct that to you as you wind up and give us your parting shot, Paul. Go ahead.
Yeah, at the risk of seeming to avoid the question, I think it feels more like a provenance question. And so, since I'm neither a historian nor a provenance researcher, I think the question of how to investigate these particular objects is maybe better directed by my co-panelists. I only wanted to add a a small footnote on what Larissa Förster said with respect to the ripple effect, that also these individual loans or the individual loans and the preliminary idea of the loan as a stepping stone can have. Because I think both the examples that she has provided with the collaboration with her Namibian colleagues and the work that Derek Peterson has been doing in collaboration with the Uganda Museum shows that the potential really lies in interinstitutional dialogue. And that that the potential rests in the relevant experts and the people who actually care for these objects and about these objects at the respective institutions, for these people to speak to each other. And that successful and smooth restitution is not necessarily obtained from diplomats of two countries being brought together in a hotel conference room, but really on the very day-to-day level where the people who actually handle these objects and care about and for them talk to each other. And in that sense, I think everything that surrounds the negotiation for a loan agreement and implementing all of these are also measures that are capable of building trust between people and building trust between institutions. And I think this is where, to which I would attribute significant parts of the ripple effect, that this opens channels for communication, it opens channels for participation as well, for communities of origin. And I think all of this makes it easier to look, or to not to look past, but at least to come to terms with the unbalanced with the unbalanced nature of a loan and with the contradiction of loaning something that was stolen in the first place. I think if we focus on the loan as an element of as a first stepping stone to healing, and actually for institutions and experts to come into dialogue, then I think it becomes, and I say this from a personal perspective, it seems to become more acceptable of a solution and more acceptable of a means than if you just look at the face value of having to ask for your own objects back, basically.
Thanks so very much for that, Paul. And yeah, let's give it to Derek. Derek, you have two questions you may think to shrink, and you are not under any duress to get us a whole thesis about this question now. I mean, Professor Chazikes, how do you learn back things that actually belong to you, and then how do you investigate the things gifted to you? How do you learn back things gifted to you? So, Derek, as you wind up, you may address yourself you may give us the beginnings of the next panel discussion.
Yeah. Okay. So I was asked also about exhibiting material outside Kampala, which I'm happy to talk to. The plan going forward, so the Uganda Museum building in Kampala is under renovation at the moment with money from the World Bank and from the Uganda government. The objects we brought back last year are in safe storage in a specially built structure that is in the corner of the lot. They're well looked after. And the hope is that later this year, early next year rather, the building will reopen sometime toward the middle of 2026. We'll have a show where these 39 artifacts will be put on display for Ugandans and other visitors to attend. We have in the past moved these exhibitions that we've done in recent years to, the regional museums. So the photographic show we did about Idi Amin's pictures, we took up to Arua and to Soroti. And, we could think about a similar plan for this exhibition too. These are, valuable and fragile objects. So, transporting them outside, can't be done lightly. We'd have to make sure that whatever conditions were appropriate for these things, some of which are 150 or more years old. So, I'm happy to think about that. We haven't really worked out an exhibition plan involving these objects as yet, as the building project has been so all-consuming for colleagues in Kampala that it's been difficult to get going on this. But the plan is to have a show next year. Okay, so how to investigate objects that we're talking about here. One thing to say, okay, so here's a controversial point for museology, and that is to say that while I understand the impulse in museology to say that communities of origin ought to be the folks who define what these things really are, I, as a historian, want also to flag up that there are abundant resources for professional students and scholars to work with to place these things in the context from which they came. The fact that Uganda's national archives are now in a better state than they've ever been in Uganda's history means that we can, as researchers, actually go through the papers of colonial government in the early 20th century and dig out information, as I've been trying to do, about the provenance history of these pieces. That is, it turns out that colonial archives are much more useful than you might expect in unpacking who the folks were from whom these things were taken, something about the circumstances in which they were taken away, what they once worked to do in public life. In other words, as a historian, I want to claim for history a role to play in recontextualizing and reinterpreting these pieces. I doubt, again, as a scholar, that it's helpful to presume that today's elders will know what pieces fabricated 150 or 200 years ago might mean. As I mentioned in my presentation, the otang from Acholi, from Atiak, that I took up to Acholi to Gulu a photograph of it earlier this year, Chief Olia's successor doesn't know what the thing is. There is no name for it that he could come to. Neither did people in Longo have a name for a similar headpiece that we brought to them. It's worth saying that cultural memory is partible, it's interrupted, it's sometimes lost. People make things up. Elders of today were not alive when these objects were acquired. The idea that somehow the elders will tell us what these things are is quite simply naive. It's specious. It's an invention of our contemporary history. Elders were not there when these things were acquired. And while we can say, well, we should talk to the elders, yes, I suppose there is value in understanding how things like this continue to be used today. We are interviewing and putting on camera cultural brokers who can interpret these things seen from a 21st century point of view. But here's the thing. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently in the past than they do today. There's been an intermediary period of at least a century in the acquisition of all of these objects. And I think it's important to accept that histories and cultures change over time, and that contemporary brokers, while they might claim authority over these pieces, in fact, are inventing their power in making those claims. So I want to push back against the presumption that museology has to be basically involve bending the knee to contemporary elders. I think that's a romantic and naive way of thinking about what curators actually should be trying to do, which is to use the resources we have at our disposal to interpret these things as best we can as artifacts of historical and political change. Dr. Chazike very interestingly asks about, how can you loan something to us that we own? I mean, one thing to say, Dr. Chazike, is as I said in my earlier presentation, the provenance history of all of these pieces is variated. Some of these pieces were acquired by purchase, others were acquired by gift, others were stolen, some were looted. It's difficult to say that there is a we from whom these things were taken in the first place, except in a very general sense, that in a moral or ethical sense, Ugandans ought to possess things that come from this part of Eastern Africa. In fact, as I've tried to flag up, many of the folks from whom these things were taken were practitioners of religious or political forms of authority that had been devalued by colonial rule. They wanted to get rid of these things for a variety of reasons, both personal and political. It's difficult to say that they were taken. They were very often, at least in many instances, willingly given to British collectors. So, the provenance history piece is important in helping us see how and why people in the late 19th, early 20th century might have divested themselves of these beautiful, consequential, important objects at the very dawn of colonial rule. I think I will end. Oh, I should mention briefly also, Dowdy, about loaning. Let me not be also naive about the Uganda Museum's position. As Eamon might be able to say, but probably won't be in a position to actually articulate, the Uganda Museum is in a precarious position, as all civic institutions like the Nomo Gallery are, both financially and organizationally. We all know that the museum sits on valuable land, and in the past there have been plans from on high to seize that land and turn it into a shopping mall. I think the more that the museum can do to position itself at the center of Uganda's public life, the more fruitful and the more consequential its future will be. One reason to celebrate this project is to say that it heralds an ongoing, I hope, set of collaborations between British institutions and the Uganda Museum to raise the museum's profile with this newly renovated building with government support, to put it more at the center of things, and thus to make it even more impossible for ill-intentioned people to steal the land and turn it into private property. So that's where I'll end.
Thanks so very much. Thank you all. We are way at the bottom of the hour, and let's bring this conversation to the bottom of it. This is not to say that we are about to exhaust its meaningfulness, but thank you so very much, my dear panelists, for really putting up with this very intricate and complicated and perhaps even more intellectually challenging than we think from the first sight about learning. And indeed, the past is a foreign country. It also has foreigners in that foreign countries. And everyone needs to get a historical visa to get in that past before they can lay their claims there. I really want to thank you all, my very keen and attentive audience. And with this, I think we shall have a serialized talk now. It's all key. It's all proven that there is a constituency of the interested, and there is a constituency of the researchers who are not about to diverse their research interests. So why don't we serialize this conversation and have it and more? Perhaps the future will be a very different common country, not just foreign to us now. Thank you, and have a good night and have a good day from wherever you are. We will avail this. I'm sure the organizer will avail this recording for purposes of learning, for returning, for reassessing our thoughts, but maybe also from how to engage next time with this very complicated past. Thank you, and have a great, productive rest of your time.
Thanks, Dowdy.
Yeah. Thanks so very much. And
Good
thanks so
evening,
much, Dad.
everyone.
Great. Bye.
Bye-bye.